In reality, you're more likely to get a graph than a process question in your academic writing test. However, it's still very important that you know how to answer these question types because they appear in about 1 in every 8 IELTS tests, and you need to be prepared for that to happen in your IELTS test. In this lesson, I'll explain the basic steps of analysing, writing and proofreading your answer, and I will also make sure you understand these clearly by showing you sample answers written with these steps. And this will ensure that you're fully prepared no matter what type of question you get in Task 1. My name is Lara Ryan, the founder of Complete Test Success, an ex-IELTS examiner and an ex-IELTS teacher at the British Council. Step number 1 is to analyse the question. Unlike the other Task 1 question types, we don't need to write anything down while we're analysing process questions. The main thing here is to just give yourself enough time so that you clearly understand how all the pieces fit together. Also, giving yourself enough time will ensure that you don't miss anything, because there are times where the information is in various parts of the image, and if all the information isn't included in your answer, that is a problem. For example, if an IELTS candidate didn't take enough time to analyse this question, they could easily miss the information about water being added here, hops being added here, and the fact that there are 2 arrows coming from this stage of the process. And step number 2 is to write the paraphrase. This will be the first sentence of your answer, and you simply take the text from the top of the image and you write that in your own words. Now, there are 2 ways that IELTS candidates typically go wrong when writing the paraphrase. Firstly, they spend way too much time writing the paraphrase and not really understanding that this is the least important sentence, so should be given the least amount of time. Secondly, candidates are afraid to use any of the words from the question, but really, if you need to copy 1 or 2 words, that's fine and it won't damage your score. So the text at the top of the question looks like this, and we only need to paraphrase this highlighted part here. Many candidates will try to paraphrase this 1 word at a time, but a good piece of advice is to focus on chunks of text rather than individual words. So I'll paraphrase this first part as the image outlines. Of course, we don't need to paraphrase the word below. And then I'll paraphrase this next part as the way in which ceiling fans are produced. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of candidates are afraid to reuse words from the question, so instead of saying ceiling fan, they would probably say something like a fan that is attached to a ceiling. But we would never refer to a ceiling fan in this way, so just copying this term is the best thing to do in this situation. And that is how to write the paraphrase. Step 3 is to write our overview. Now, an overview is a general description of the process, and the paraphrase and the overview together will make up our first paragraph. Now, because you're not allowed to write specific information in your overview, I've come up with a unique formula that you can use for process questions. In the overview, you will firstly state the first and the last steps. You will say how many stages there are, and then you will describe the methods, tools, or influences. So let me show you examples of these 3 things. Firstly, we'll look at the first and last step. In this process here, you can see that the steps are numbered. So number 1 is this one here, where it says frozen mammoth. And the last step is number 8, where it says mammoth-elephant hybrid. So the first part of my overview will be this information. Overall, the process begins with a frozen mammoth and ends with a mammoth-elephant hybrid. If it was possible, I would paraphrase the names of the steps. But in this case, it's not possible, so it's fine to use the words from the question. But not all process questions will have the steps numbered, which means there are times where we need to decide for ourselves where it starts and where it ends. So for this question, I'm going to say that the seeds are the beginning of the process, but if you feel like there's a more logical place to begin, that would be fine as well. And once again, as the first part of the overview, we write down the first and last steps. Overall, the cycle begins with seeds and finishes with the plant becoming fruits with seeds. So that's how you write the first part of the overview, and now we're going to write down the number of stages. This question is already numbered, so we'll just write down, in total there are 8 steps. In this other question, however, we will need to count how many stages there are first, and then we just write down that number in the same way. In total, there are 7 phases. Now, in that second question about corn, it was very clear how many stages there were, but then on occasion you might get a question where it's a bit ambiguous. So you'll need to decide for yourself, but you don't need to worry about this because whatever decision you make, the the examiner will agree with. For example, in this process here, some candidates might decide that this part here is 1 step, and other candidates might decide that it's actually 2 steps. Either way would be acceptable, as the question doesn't clearly state that piece of information. And that brings us to the third part of the overview, where we describe the methods, tools, or influences. And this part of the overview depends on whether it's a natural or a man-made process. When it's man-made, we'll describe the machinery involved, or we'll describe whether it's automated or needs to be done manually, and that type of thing. And then when it's natural, we'll describe any external influences involved in the process. So this process is man-made, and we can see that most of the steps would need to be performed in a science lab. So we can say, and most of them require specialized scientific knowledge. And that is our complete overview for this process. And this second process that we've been looking at is natural, and this particular one has no external influences, so we will just say that, which require no external influences. If the image had showed us things like birds carrying the seeds or the rain watering the plant, we would have to put that in our overview. In step 4, we write the details paragraphs, and these will be the second and the third paragraphs of our answer. And in these paragraphs, we write detailed descriptions of each step in the process. In general, we aim to describe about half of the steps in the first details paragraph and describe the rest of the process in the second details paragraph. Now, because all of these processes are just showing you how to do something, present simple will be the predominant grammar tense that we use. And when the process is man-made, you will very often need to use passive structures because we're focusing on what's happening, not who is doing it. Then the fifth and final step is to proofread your finished answer. This is simply giving yourself time to find and fix any vocabulary or any grammar mistakes that you've made without noticing while you were writing your answer. And also, you might notice that you've overused some words while you were writing the answer, and this is a good opportunity to fix that and improve your vocabulary range. Now, before we look at the first sample answer, I just want to remind you that I have free live feedback lessons every week for Academic Task 1 as well as Task 2, and you'll find a link to join those lessons in the video description. So this here is the question we will use to write the first sample answer. So in step 1, we take some time to analyze the question, and then we move on to step 2 and write the paraphrase. The image indicates the several phases required for the production of whiskey using malt barley. And then we need to write the overview using those 3 components that we already looked at. To start, we describe the first and last steps. Overall, the process begins with the malt barley being grown and ends with the consumption of the finished product. Then we say the number of stages. There are a total of 12 steps. And finally, we describe the methods, tools, or influences, requiring different types of machinery and some manual work. And that there is the first paragraph complete, so now we need to write paragraph 2 and paragraph 3, the details paragraphs. Here's the first one. First of all, the malt barley crop is grown, and after that it is harvested. The harvested malt barley is then added to a machine for preparation, before moving to another piece of machinery where it is mashed. Following that, another piece of equipment is used to allow the malt barley to ferment. And the second details paragraph. After fermentation, there are 2 cycles of distillation, and from this, the resulting substance moves to the next phase where it is aged. After aging, the whiskey production process is completely finished, and it is bottled by an automated machine. Later, the bottles are loaded into a truck for delivery to bars, where the whiskey is traded and subsequently consumed. Now, for process questions, one thing that you really need for the details paragraphs are words for sequencing. So let's have a look at the ones that were used in this sample answer. So here are the 3 paragraphs we just looked at, and here are the types of words for sequencing that I mentioned. First of all, after that, then, before, following that, from this, next, after, later, subsequently. And it's important that you're able to use these types of words when you're answering process questions. Now, if you're finding this video to be helpful, please give me some positive feedback by clicking like on the video. Here is the next question that we will look at. And like before, we'll take some time to analyze it and then write the paraphrase. The image outlines the stages used in a water purification plant to produce potable water. And here's the overview with the same 3 components as before. Overall, the process begins with raw water and ends with water that is fit for home consumption. There are a total of 7 stages and 5 ingredients are added to the water at various times during this completely automated process. Now, you might be a bit confused why I said that there are 7 stages, so let me explain this to you. The way I counted them was these here being my 7 stages, and then I said that each of the 5 red arrows was an ingredient being added rather than a unique stage. However, if you had just said that there are 12 stages in this process, that would be completely acceptable as well. So now it's time to look at paragraphs 2 and 3, and the first details paragraph. Initially, raw water is diverted from the river into the plant, where coagulants are put into the water before the water is mixed in a coagulation and flocculation basin. From here, the water is transferred to a sedimentation basin, where it sits so that sediments fall and gather on the bottom. Before the next step, where the water is filtered, the addition of polymer to the water occurs. And then the second details paragraph. Once the water is passed through the filter, fluoride and disinfectant are added before the water collects in a disinfectant basin. Once the process in the disinfectant basin is finished, the last part of the water purification process is completed by putting corrosion control into the water. Finally, the treated water is stored in the plant before the water is transported for home consumption. So with that, we've finished writing the answer, but we still have step number 5 where we proofread the answer. So here are the 3 paragraphs again. And when I was proofreading this, I noticed that I had really overused the words water and before. Just look how many times I used both of these words. Once I noticed this, I went back and I increased my range of vocabulary by removing any instances of these that weren't necessary. This is what the essay looked like when I was finished, but I'm not going to read this out to you again, as that wouldn't be a good use of your time. But you're welcome to pause the video if you'd like to read it by yourself. Now, I do have more IELTS lessons like this one coming up, so make sure that you like my page or you subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss any of those. The 2 questions that we've looked at so far in this lesson were man-made processes, so the next 2 will be natural processes. And this question here shows the life cycle of a frog. So once more, we'll analyse the question and then write the paraphrase. The image outlines the several phases involved in a frog's life cycle. Then, like before, the first part of the overview is to say what the first and last steps are. Overall, this animal begins as an egg and in the end becomes a fully formed adult frog. Then we say how many stages there are. This one is numbered, so we just use the highest figure from the question. In total, there are 7 stages. And finally, we describe what external factors are involved. And once more, with this question, there actually aren't any, so we will just say that. And it is an entirely self-contained process as there are no external influences. So as you can see with the natural process, the only difference is really that last part of the overview. Before we look at the first details paragraph, I just want to point out that this is a really good example of a question that has information in many different parts of the picture. Remember that every piece of information here must be included in the details paragraphs, so we need to make sure that we haven't missed anything. So the first details paragraph says, the life cycle begins with a cluster of eggs being laid in calm or static water, and after 2 to 3 days, these develop into embryos. After this, a tadpole with gills, a mouth, and a tail emerges from one of the embryos. Subsequently, the tadpole grows 2 legs near the base of its tail. And the last paragraph, after 2 or 3 weeks, another 2 legs appear toward the front of the tadpole's body, and between 2 or 3 weeks after that, the creature has a much shorter tail and is now referred to as a froglet. Then finally, it develops into an adult frog that appears to have no tail before the process repeats itself with new eggs being laid. Now, you'll remember from the first 2 questions we looked at about whiskey and water purification that there was a distinct start and end to those processes. However, this one is different. This one is cyclical. And what happens is the last stage leads back to the first stage. And when this happens, it's very important that we mention this at the end of the second details paragraph. And as you can see in the highlighted part here, this is exactly what I have done. And here is the full sample answer. And in your writing test, make sure that you always leave lines between each paragraph like this so that the examiner is very clear on where each one starts and ends. Now, This lesson about process questions actually concludes my series on Academic Task 1, and you'll find the link to the complete playlist in the video description. And that brings us to the final question. This one shows the carbon cycle, and really it's a bit more complicated than the average Task 1 process question. But that doesn't change what we need to do. We'll probably need a bit more time when analysing this question, and after that we just write the paraphrase, overview and 2 details paragraphs. Now, when I first looked at this, what I decided was that I would use carbon dioxide at the top as my first stage, and then I just worked my way around so that I could analyse it completely. Once I was happy that I had given myself enough time to fully understand what I was looking at, I wrote the first paragraph. The image outlines the various phases included in the carbon cycle. Overall, the process begins with carbon dioxide transferring from the air into trees, and ends with it being returned into the atmosphere from various sources. In total, there are 7 stages, most of which are natural, but also including some human influence. Then, to logically organise my details paragraphs, I decided to go with carbon dioxide and the arrows moving downwards in the first details paragraph, and then all of the arrows moving upwards in the second details paragraph. Here's the first one. First of all, through the process of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is extracted from the air and enters trees. After this, trees and animals both become dead organisms and waste products which are found deep below the Earth's surface. Moving even deeper underground, it can be seen that there are deposits of fossils and fossil fuel. And the last paragraph, from here, the dead organisms, waste products, fossils and fossil fuel are extracted for use in cars and factories, which in turn create transportation and factory emissions, which release the carbon dioxide back into the air. As well as these emissions, carbon dioxide is returned to the atmosphere from natural sources, which are animal respiration, organic carbon, and root respiration in plants. And that is our full essay completed. So with that, if a process question appears in your IELTS test, you know what to do. If you would like to see more sample answers like the ones we just looked at, you will find those on my website. And just let me know in the comments if you feel ready for the IELTS writing test yet.